I love Trails, in case that wasn't clear from some of the other videos on my channel. It's one of my favorite series and, well, pieces of fiction of all time. There's something about the games that just make me glad to be alive to be able to experience them. And I think that the series manages to maintain such a consistent level of amazing quality like no other series that I have experienced. Even the ones that I would say that I like a bit more. So with the recent news of Trails Through Daybreak getting a release date for its official English translation, and murmurs that we might also be getting Kiseki and the Trails in the Sky FC remake in 2025 as well, I'm in a big Trails mood. So today I wanted to rank all of the Trails games that I have personally played from my least favorite to my favorite. So basically all the games that have been officially released in English. In other words, from Trails in the Sky first chapter all the way up to Trails Through Daybreak. I'll also be throwing the Legend of Nayuta Boundless Trails in for fun as well. Why another ranking video, you ask? Because I like doing these game ranking videos, and I want another excuse to talk about Trails. Before we begin though, I would like to make some things clear. Trails is a very opinionated fan base, and I know that everybody has their own opinions on these games. However, I would like to remind everyone watching that this list is just my opinion. With the exception of one game on this list, which I still like, mind you, I would consider every game featured to be among my favorite games of all time. I'm going to have to get real nitpicky about this to rank some of these games, but please remember that even if a game is ranked a little lower on this list, that doesn't mean that I don't like it or that there is a significant gap between it and, hell, even my favorite game in the series. Even though I don't like using numbered rankings for games and such, I'd still consider these games to all be a 10 out of 10, with one exception, which will be clear shortly. However, I would like to ask everyone to please be respectful in the comments below. Not just to me, but more so to others in the comments. Also, this will probably be a long one, because if you've watched my podcast with my friend Mr. VG Preserver on YouTube.com, shameless plug, check it out, you know that once I get started talking about this series, I don't stop. So get comfy, take a bathroom break, grab some snacks, hydrate, do whatever you gotta do to get relaxed. Without further ado, let's get started. Also, no spoilers ahead. Yeah, I don't think this one was a surprise. The only spin-off on this list is also my least favorite and the only game in the series that I wouldn't put as one of my favorite games of all time. That doesn't mean that I dislike Nayuta though. It's honestly a really good game. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it, considering how different the game is from the rest of the series. I've heard this game described as East combat with Trails writing, but I honestly don't agree with that. Sure, the structure of the story is closer to Trails and the combat is closer to East, but I think that neither ever reaches the same heights as those series. Heck, I would even say that I enjoyed the stories of the few East games that I've played over Nayuta's, same with the main series Trails combat. I definitely enjoyed the turn-based systems of the main series more than the gameplay in Nayuta, but that's a whole different ballpark. With that said though, I did really enjoy the gameplay, and combat especially. The replayability of the levels with the different seasons and trying to get all the stars for each one was a really addictive gameplay loop. I also like how many combat options you have with the different sword techniques, arts, and administrator abilities. It made for a lot more depth than I anticipated. The story and characters took a bit for me to warm up to, however. They aren't bad by any means, but the game never really grabbed me emotionally like other Trails games, which is honestly the crux of its placement here. That isn't to say that I didn't have any emotional connection to the characters or story. I liked a lot of them, and the story did grab me by the end, but just not as much as the main series titles. I think the Trails name kind of worked against it in that sense for me. But I understand that I should judge a game for what it is rather than what it isn't. And what this game is a good time all around, even if not as narratively deep as I would have liked. Honestly, what it comes down to for me is that I think this game's greatest strength and its greatest weakness is its shorter length. I managed to do pretty much everything you can do in a single standard new game playthrough, and I barely cracked the 30-hour mark. Which is saying a lot, because I like to take RPGs slow. And if my Daybreak playtime is anything to go by, I mean really slow. But I do think that Nayuta hits this weird zone of enjoyability for me in terms of being short enough to not allow the characters and the story to truly cook, but also never feeling like it overstayed its welcome. At the end of the day, though, I do think Nayuta is a really solid JRPG, and one I would definitely recommend. The combat is fun, the characters and story are enjoyable, if a bit barren in some places. The world is interesting despite not being connected to Zamoria, and the soundtrack is amazing. A great game, but not one that I think reaches the heights of the main series. So now that we've gotten Nayuta out of the way, every game from this point on is among my favorite games of all time. So you are about to hear me give the longest glazing session to this series imaginable. Trails in the Sky the Third is a fantastic game. It has the best soundtrack in the Sky trilogy in my opinion, some of the best character moments in the series, probably the best combat in the Liberal arc, and has set up plot elements that are still relevant so many games later. I love this game. So after all of that, you're probably wondering why I would place this game this low. And honestly, it's just because this game is a dungeon crawler. I'm not the biggest fan of dungeon crawlers, just off rip, as I really love me a good RPG town to learn about the people and the world, but I think it hurts a little more in Trails specifically. For me, some of the best parts of Trails comes from talking to the NPCs and learning about what's going on in the world, or even in their personal lives. It's one of the series' biggest strengths in my opinion. So it being absent from Sky the Third is a big miss in my book. With that said, this game has so many amazing moments to count. Kevin and Rias' past and character arcs, the whole thing with the Schwarzritter, Ren's backstory, Osborne's introduction and Olivier's declaration, the whole final dungeon, heck, even some of the goofier things like Gilbert. I honestly adore this game, and it makes me sad that it had this reputation in the fandom for being skippable for the longest time, because it is definitely not skippable. I wish I could say more about this game, but it's probably the game in the series that I remember the least specifics for. I'm definitely going to have to do a Sky Trilogy replay sometime soon. So yeah, while I love this game to death, I will have to place it here as I just like the other games a bit more. The game that started it all. Sky First Chapter is among the comfiest games that I've ever played. The journey embarked by Estelle and Joshua to become senior bracers is one of the highlights of the series as a whole for me. It's honestly an amazing start in an unforgettable journey. On to the specifics. This game set the stage for a lot of the things in the series, such as the world, the various organizations, the action time system, orbit customization, the works. And I think that at the end of the day, it stuck the landing in all of these areas. The towns are each given their own times to shine and set themselves apart from the others, while also helping to build the kingdom of Liberl as a whole. The main plot itself is also really good for what is essentially a 40-hour prologue, especially the entire ending sequence of the game. However, I think this game really shines in its character writing. The main cast is instantly built to be likable and feel human. Dialogue between the characters, from more deeply personal interactions to the comedic back and forths, are expertly written. The characters are so good in this game that it's pretty much seen as a benchmark for the rest of the series. But the real stars of the show are Estelle and Joshua. Now, full disclosure, when I first played the game many years ago, I wasn't huge on Estelle as a protagonist. Not that I didn't like her, mind you, but I just wasn't on the Bestel train yet. Emphasis on yet. I honestly don't know what past me was thinking, because looking back on this game, Estelle is amazing from her first few lines, and even in this game alone, stands among my favorite protagonists in anything ever. She's also my second favorite protagonist in the series, only closely being beat out by Reem for me. But her relationship with Joshua elevates her to a whole other level. The way these two bounce off of each other in a way that conveys their strengths and weaknesses to the player, while also making their relationship incredibly endearing, is a writing masterclass. With all that said though, I do think this game's biggest weakness is its slow pacing. Now, Trails notoriously has slow pacing, especially in the ARC starter games, but Sky FC definitely takes the cake. It is a very slow burn. Don't get me wrong, I love a slow burn, and I especially love this game. but I do think that it would be disingenuous to say that the pacing didn't feel slow, even to me on my first playthrough. The story doesn't really kick into high gear until about halfway through the penultimate chapter, which I think is a bit too far into the game for my liking. And I also think that's why this game in particular is a hard sell to newer players. However, in retrospect, I do really like what the game was going for with its pacing as a way to set up for Sky SC. All in all, this game is amazing, and it holds a special place in my heart. However, I will have to place it lower on the list due to the fact that I just think the later games do better in almost every aspect, like the gameplay, world building, plot, and soundtrack. Make no mistake though, I still recognize that this is just a side effect of Sky FC being the first game in the Trail series, so obviously the later games are going to improve and iterate on certain things. Sky FC is still a near perfect start to one of the best experiences in all of gaming. Trails from Zero is a game that surprised me in a lot of ways. As someone who strictly keeps to the official English releases, Zero was the greatest mystery to me for a long time. I'd heard a lot about Azure, and most of the plot points and moments in the Crossbell arc that are brought up in the Cold Steel games have to do with Azure, so Zero was a big blind spot for me. I was incredibly excited to finally get to play it a few years ago, and I was not disappointed. Zero is a fantastic game. Starting with what I think is the biggest strength of Zero, that being the setting. Crossbell, and especially Crossbell City, feels like its own character. The game manages to endear the player to both the city itself and the people who live in it pretty early in its runtime in a way that makes you feel the same strong emotions to protect it that the SSS does. The world building itself for the city and the state as a whole is also some of the best in the series. The rival political factions doing the bidding of the neighboring superpowers, the various criminal organizations at play and their connections to said nations and political factions, and even the various laws and restrictions that are set in place to keep the state and its citizens under the heels of its neighbors. It's all so good. I also love the more modern setting of Crossbell City. It helps to display just how quickly technology is advancing and how it may often clash with various aspects of life for the people of Sumeria. The relationship the SSS has with the Bracer Guild is also something that I really like. It's almost like they have to catch up to the work that you did in the previous arc, even if the two things aren't directly related per se. The new additions to the battle system are also really fun and make it one of the best of the older chibi isometric style games. I also think this game, along with Azure, Cold Steel 1, and Cold Steel 2, have the best soundtracks in the entire series. With that said though, I do have a few negatives for this game. While I do like the SSS and supporting cast, I feel like they aren't as strong as the main casts in other arcs. The chemistry they have together is amazing, I'll never knock that. But individually as characters, I think they're among the weaker main casts in the series. The game has a lot of great character moments, and I think Azure does as well, but in retrospect, I felt like a lot of them didn't go in super interesting directions, if they had any resolution at all. Sure, you could say the same for other characters in some of the other main casts in Liberl and Erebonia, but I think the smaller main cast of the Crossbell arc makes this aspect stand out even more. This is not to say that the characters are bad, by the way. I love them, even if most don't get super involved character arcs. It's just a situation of me preferring how the other main casts are handled a little bit better. I also think this game didn't hit me as emotionally as the other arc starters. The emotional height of this game for me was the Ren stuff, which was great, don't get me wrong, but it didn't leave me feeling as emotionally connected as Sky FC or Cold Steel 1. Lastly, I think the villains in this game aren't that great. This is a problem I have with the Crossbell arc as a whole, but it really stood out in this game. The final villain felt like it came out of nowhere in the story, even if it was pretty obvious who it was. I just wish their involvement and the mystery was built up a little bit more throughout the game, as well as giving us better insight into their personality and goals, rather than just shove all that in the 11th hour. At the end of the day, I love Trails from Zero. The setting, the gameplay, the music, the characters, and the story are all still top tier despite the few problems I have with the game. Honestly, the reason it's this low is just because I like the other games a bit more. You're going to be hearing that phrase a lot in this video. Trails Through Daybreak is one that took me a bit to warm up to in comparison to the other games in the series. Obviously, I still think it was great, but in the opening hours of the game, I felt like some of that Trails sauce just wasn't as present this time around. My feelings on it changed as it went on, however, I still have a few issues with it. Starting with the gameplay, Daybreak makes a huge shift in the series' combat and customization. The game uses a hybrid action and turn-based system, and I honestly love how seamless it is to transition between the two. I do, however, feel like the action combat is a bit basic for my liking, only really having 3 things to do, those being standard attack, heavy attack, and dodge, which does get a bit repetitive fairly early on. With that said, the aforementioned seamlessness when transitioning from field battles to command battles does allow for you to make use of the stun system to switch things up with some of the beefier enemies in the game. I do, however, wish that you could do some more actions in the field, maybe be able to perform certain crafts as a way to speed up field battles a bit, and make them less repetitive. On the turn-based side of things, it's the same formula that Trails is known for, with a few adjustments. I at first wasn't a big fan of the ability to move without using a turn, but it started to grow on me as the game went on. I do think that the balancing of the game is a bit wonky, especially with how S-crafts only cost 100 CP. They're definitely weaker in terms of pure damage than they are in Cold Steel and Crossbow, especially Azure for Crossbow, but the ability to easily spam them makes them an easy way to break the game. That, coupled with the boost system, makes it feel like Falcom is incentivizing you to spam them. The boost system is another change that I am still not a big fan of, especially with how much is tied into it. Hollow cores requiring boosting to make full use of a character's build is probably my biggest gripe. And this one is a minor gripe, but I'm also not a fan of the UI for the turn order in this game. It's a bit too confusing for my liking, and I much prefer the older style of just having it on the side of the screen. Customization is another aspect that I'm a bit iffy on in this game. Daybreak doesn't have much quartz variety, which is understandable since it's the first game after a switch up, but this game following CS4 and Reverie, which had insane variety, makes it stand out just a bit more. That and the Zypha's giving you way more slots to work with than previous orbits. The way shard skills and arts work in this game is also something that I'm not too big on. I think the return of elemental values is cool, but I found most shard skills to be pretty useless in the grand scheme of things. Also, relegating the ability to steal turn bonuses to a shard skill is an egregious change to me, but I hear that it is fixed in Daybreak 2. Drivers also feel super limited, especially in the early game, with most only offering 2 slots for custom arts. Honestly, it felt like Falcom was trying to combine the Sky and Crossbow art style of elemental values with the Cold Steel method of just having the art as its own quartz. But the result in this game is way worse than either of those 2 styles in my opinion. Also, and this is incredibly insignificant mind you, I don't think this ruins the game or anything, but why are the EP quartz in this game Earth Element? It just feels wrong. So all of those complaints come with the big asterisks of this game being the first after the largest change in combat that the series has seen. I trust Falcom to iterate on these ideas and make something truly special. They've done it before with the combat in the series. Most of these complaints that I have are just growing pains. The new stuff just needs a bit more time to cook. In terms of the story, I was a bit skeptical in the early hours of Daybreak. Don't get me wrong, I still consider it to be a great story for an RPG, but it wasn't living up to the Trail standard for me at first. Especially after the whole private eye film noir vibes presented in the prologue. It wasn't until midway through Chapter 3 that I started to really get hooked, and I really loved the story in the latter half of the game. My main issues with it, however, remain the game's over-reliance on death and the repetitive nature of most of the chapters. For the first point, avoiding spoilers, Daybreak marks a shift where Falcom tried to tell a darker story, or At least that's how it was presented to me before I played the game. Most of the game is still that same mix of dark and light that the series is known for. Even the darker elements of this game don't reach the depths the series has gone to before with some of the older games. Skyther! Regardless, Daybreak tries to set its tone fairly early on with showing more death. Now, I don't have a problem when a story uses death as a narrative tool, and I know a lot of people think the series, especially in the Cold Steel games, didn't use it enough, which is a sentiment that I heavily disagree with personally. However, I much prefer it when death is used sparingly, as otherwise it begins to feel cheap or loses its punch in my opinion. Daybreak wanders a bit into that territory. All but one death had no emotional impact on me, and I found myself being able to pick out who was going to get iced before it even happened. Again, I don't have a problem with it in theory, but I feel like the game didn't do enough of the legwork to really make me care in most cases. That leads me into my other issue. The game's structure is very repetitive, even by Trails standards. Most chapters follow a similar structure to the point that I could pick out when certain moments were going to happen before they happened. It wasn't until the intermission that this structure was shaken up. This repetitiveness isn't necessarily bad, mind you. Cold Steel 3 is probably the most repetitive game in the series, and as you can tell by its absence in the video so far, I still really love that game. I do, however, wish that this game shook up the formula a bit in the earlier chapters. In terms of characters, I really love the ASO. Their personalities and dynamics with each other are amazing, and while I don't have them on the same level as Class 7 or Team Lamerle as of yet, this game did a lot to endear me to the group as a whole, so I have no doubt that my love for them will continue to grow as the arc progresses. I do, however, think that this game suffers a bit too much from the save it for the sequel type of characters in the main cast for my liking. It made it so that while I love the ASO as a group, the individual members aren't as strong in their introduction in terms of gaining my interest in their future arcs as the casts in the other arc starters. Aaron and Ferry especially are two that I have absolutely no idea where their characters are going. With that said, Falcom loves to play the long game with Trails, and I love experiencing said long game, so I have no doubt that there will be payoff for these characters. However, Van and Agnes stole the show in my opinion. I wasn't too hot on Van at first, but seeing the layers of his personality peeled off one by one as the game goes on, and gaining a greater glimpse into who he is at his core is a highlight of the game for me. I love his general philosophy. He isn't on the same level as Estelle and Reen for me yet, but he's gaining on them. Agnes's growth throughout the game is also a highlight. Seeing her worldview broaden in real time as the game progresses made for her being one of my favorite characters in the main cast. The villains, however, were a bit disappointing. I really wish the game took more time to flesh out its members earlier on. Making them foils in the 11th hour wasn't the right move in my opinion. It made the members feel uninteresting, especially when compared to the antagonists of Sky FC and Cold Steel 1. Olympia was my favorite of the group by far, and I was really upset that we got most of her stuff so late. I also just wasn't a fan of Dante's. I definitely think he's on the weaker end of Trails antagonists. Some final things. I love Calvard as a setting. The different cultures and world building present from the nation being a melting pot is so good. I also love Edith as a hub area. The mix between seedy back alleys and busy thoroughfares makes it one of my favorite cities in the series. I also really love the soundtrack, which is something that I know a lot of people don't like. What can I say? It's got some bangers, like In the Dawn, Resonance of Ray, and Unmitigated Evil, to name a few. I also think this game has some of the best side quests in the series, even if I'm still a bit iffy on the alignment system. I don't hate it on principle, but I do think it clashes with some main story stuff in ways that I'm not a big fan of. All in all, despite some issues I have with Daybreak, I still really love this game, and honestly, if it wasn't for one other game released this year, Daybreak would be far and away my favorite game of 2024. I cannot wait to see what the Calvert arc brings next. This might be a contentious placement on the list, but next up we have Trails to Azure. Azure, for the longest time, has been considered the golden child of the Trails series. At least from my experience, you wouldn't see any discussion about the best game or arc without someone saying something along the lines of, well, nothing beats Ao. Ao being the Japanese name for Azure if you're watching this and have no knowledge of the series. It wasn't until Azure received an official localization that that seemingly unshakable sentiment changed due to more people with differing opinions playing the game for the first time. Nowadays, I feel like you're just as likely to find people who say it's their least favorite in the series as people who say it's their favorite. I'm more middle of the road, as you can tell from its placement here. Regardless, I love Azure. It's one of those games that I just did not want to end. But I would be lying if I said that I feel like it totally lived up to the hype. What I mean by that is hype as far and away the best Trails game, not hype as an amazing game and a life-changing experience, because I do find it to be an amazing game and a life-changing experience. Firstly, let's talk about the characters. Now, full disclosure, I think that Azure is probably the weakest entry in the series in terms of character writing. Don't get me wrong, it has some amazing character moments and a few character arcs that are really good. Randy's is a standout, and Risha's character arc has placed her among my favorite Trails characters of all time, where she remains to this day. Lloyd also has a lot of great moments that made me love him as a protagonist much more than I did after playing Zero. However, that's really it. Most of the other characters don't have a ton of stuff going on in Azure, especially when compared to the other Climax games like Sky SC, Cold Steel 2, and Cold Steel 4. Granted, those games also have characters that don't have as amazing character arcs when compared to others, but like I said in the Zero entry, I think that the much smaller cast size of the Crossbow arc makes this problem stand out even more. The antagonists are also another miss in my opinion, and I know that's a pretty cold take. There was only really one that I found to be compelling as an antagonist in terms of motivation and philosophy, while the others are just kind of there. Also, while I don't mind the reveal of the mastermind, and I do think that their motivation is interesting, I really wish that the game spent way more time focusing on their backstory and philosophy. Or better yet, have the presence of a mastermind be known throughout the story so that you can piece the clues together as the game goes on, rather than in an incredibly missable side quest right before the reveal. All in all, I think this issue with character arcs feeling like they need more focus is a result of the general structure of the Crossbell arc. Unlike the other arcs in the series, Zero and Azure are pretty standalone when compared to the likes of Sky FC and Sky SC, or Cold Steel 1 and Cold Steel 2, or Cold Steel 3 and Cold Steel 4. Because of that, I think Azure has to do a lot more of its own heavy lifting for its story than the other arc enders. Zero does do a lot of setup for the world and the characters, but I feel like the main story of Azure doesn't get as much from Zero as it should have. This leads to the first half of the game feeling a bit slow in my opinion, but everything from the end of Chapter 3 onwards goes at breakneck speed. Don't get me wrong, what actually happens is amazing, and the finale of Azure is my favorite part of the game because of this. And I know that's a hot take, but hey, this is my video, so go suck on a palm. But I think it's this pacing that made it so that the characters weren't given the room to breathe that they needed, and it left many characters like Noelle and Ellie to feel underutilized in my opinion, which sucks because I really like Noelle and Ellie. However, while I don't consider Azure to be a very character-heavy game, its plot is a whole other story. Azure is quite possibly one of the most important games in the entire series in terms of the story of the series as a whole. Even in a vacuum, though, the story of Azure is phenomenal. Everything from the geopolitics to the clash of different factions feels weighty because of the long-lasting consequences of almost every action. Seeing the political maneuvering of the different nations and the power of their intelligence divisions at work is a high point of the Trails series in my opinion, and Azure has some of the best moments of this. Even the subtle world building present with moments like the conversations with the different national leaders during the trade conference is masterfully done. And while I do think that the ending isn't as satisfying as the other arc enders, the emotions behind it and the greater meaning it has for the series as a whole makes for such a memorable experience. One last complaint that I have is that Azure has the worst boss design in the series, in my opinion. The game has the best combat of the chibi isometric style games, and it added what is, in my opinion, one of the best things added to the combat in the entire series, that being Master Chords. But man, are some of the bosses just downright unfun to fight, especially the ones that have some sort of bonus DP requirement. They're just frustrating. And don't get me started on the final boss. Definitely the worst final boss in the series by a country mile. Don't get me wrong, the music, the set pieces, the general circumstances of the fight, those are all amazing. But the boss design is booty cheeks. Getting punished for being too strong in an 80 to 100 hour RPG is whack, especially for the final boss. The boss before it wasn't great either. All in all though, I love Azure. Like I said, I did pretty much everything that could be done in a first playthrough, and I still didn't want it to end. And while I do find the character arcs to be a bit lackluster, I still love the main cast and their dynamics with each other. And the story is just amazing. This game would have been my favorite game of 2023 if not for another game on this list also getting its official translation in 2023. Also, as I said in the Zero section, Azure's soundtrack is up there with Zero, Cold Steel 1, and Cold Steel 2 as my favorite soundtracks in the series, which is saying something because all of the series soundtracks are absolute bangers. Man, I love this game, but I just like the games above it a little more. Trails of Cold Steel 3 holds a special place in my heart. A bit of background for this one. I was in a not so great place when this game released, and it was a key reason in pulling me out of that dark place. Because of that, I will always hold this game in high regard. And for the longest time, I would have placed this game as my favorite in the entire series. However, after a few replays, it has dropped to this point on the list. Getting a bit more into specifics and starting with the gameplay, this game was the first game to use the combat and customization style that would eventually become my favorite turn-based battle system of all time. However, it wasn't to that level yet at the time of this game's release. The custom and gameplay weren't majorly changed from Cold Steel 1 and 2, like the transition from Azure to CS1 or Reverie to Daybreak were. However, there were a few iterations that really fleshed out the combat a lot more. Firstly was the addition of Brave Orders. These added a whole lot of strategy to the game as they allowed you to use Brave Points, which were previously only used for Rush and Burst, to activate a character-specific ability that would affect the whole party for a certain number of turns. Everything from giving characters perfect guard, to stat buffs, to increasing critical hit rates. It's honestly one of the cooler additions to the series combat. However, the balancing for Brave Orders in this game was whack. They can be used to easily break the game in half. Another new addition was the break gauge. All enemies have a break meter, which when exhausted would give them massive amounts of delay and allow them to take more damage with physical attacks, also always unbalancing the enemy while in break state. It's honestly a really cool mechanic and one that I really love. My only issue with it is that bosses tend to have a scripted health threshold that when reached sees them going into an enhanced state, which means that an S-Craft is coming up in their next turn. This isn't that much of a problem to me, but when that threshold is hit, the boss says some line about getting serious or something at that exact moment. When that happens, the break gauge of the boss will be restored automatically, even if they were already in break state. It's honestly a bit frustrating, especially if you were building up to a certain point. I just wish that it would happen on the boss's next turn instead of immediately. On the customization side, Most things are the same from Cold Steel 1 and 2, except a few changes to the different quartz. The biggest change, however, is the addition of sub-master quartz. This system allows you to use the first ability of another master quartz on any character, in addition to the full set of abilities of their main master quartz. This allows for some really cool combinations to be made and really expands the build variety. My only issue with it in this game specifically is that much like how main master quartz work, you are only able to equip a master quartz as the sub-master quartz for a single character at a time, which I think just limits your options. However, this was fixed in Cold Steel 4 and Reverie. In terms of the story, I really love Cold Steel 3's. The different reveals and big moments from each chapter are all really well done, and seeing the consequences of Cold Steel 2 and Azure play out in this game and lead into future conflicts in the series is so good. It's honestly hard for me to pick a favorite chapter from this game because they are all filled to the brim with amazing moments. That ending is also brutal in a good way. With that said, I do think this game is incredibly repetitive. The first 3 chapters follow the same formula, and the final bosses of each chapter feel really samey, to avoid spoilers. Not just that, but the cutscene pacing also plays into this repetitiveness, especially in the moments that see Reen traveling with the members of Old Class 7. Now, I don't think this repetitiveness is bad per se, and I didn't really notice it too much on my first playthrough, but on replays, it's an issue that really stood out to me. In terms of characters, I love the main cast of this game. New Class 7 is amazing, and I love every single member. I still prefer Old Class 7, but the newer generation fits right in. I also love the students and faculty at the branch campus. Talking with them in between each chapter really endeared me to the branch campus and the town of Leaves as well. Not so much to the level of Trista, but it's pretty damn close. The antagonists in this game are also really good. I don't want to say too much on this one to avoid spoilers, but this game is where we see a certain character's plan start to come to fruition, and they really live up to the hype. All in all, I just love Cold Steel 3. It's a game that means a lot to me, and even though it's moved down on my ranking, I still consider it close to my heart. Honestly, this game and Azure are fighting it out for the spot. Maybe it'll change after I replay Azure in the future, but for right now, I'll place CS3 here. I'm biased, what can I say? I didn't know what to expect with Trails into Reverie. Everything I heard about it beforehand was that it was an epilogue game like Sky the Third, but also a love letter to all that came before it in the Trails series. And all of that is true, but I feel like the game is much more than just that. Starting with the gameplay, once again, the series uses the same systems as Cold Steel 3 and 4, leaning a bit more towards the Cold Steel 4 balancing. The biggest new addition was the United Fronts. There were 3 types: attack, art, and heal. In my first playthrough, I didn't find a ton of use from these systems, but on replay in Nightmare mode, I found that they have a lot of usability, especially when you're in a pinch. Falcom also added a metric fuckton of new quartz, expanding the customization options to dizzying levels. That coupled with the 51, you heard me correctly, 51 playable characters to choose from, makes for one of the most diverse and fun gameplay experiences in the series. The game makes full use of this insane character roster with the True Reverie corridor. This is a procedurally generated dungeon that you can return to at any time in the game and make full use of all of the characters you have unlocked, regardless of physical distance in the story. Whether it's to gain some levels or just mess around with the different builds, the True Reverie corridor is an amazing playground for the player to make full use of the game's systems. Now, I was a bit iffy on the True Reverie corridor at first, as I felt like the procedurally generated levels and the whole plot point of characters losing their memories of what's going on in the main story of the game would run its course pretty quickly, but I wound up really liking it as a mechanic. Not just for the aforementioned reasons, but also because of the daydreams, mini-games, and character interactions within the hub area. The normal battle theme of the True Reverie corridor also helped, absolute banger. The mini-games are self-explanatory, and are all pretty fun, except for the Tearfing one. I was not a big fan of the Deerfing one. Daydreams are pretty much this game's version of Doors from Sky the Third, and they are just as good here. There are so many great ones, with the Olivert one and the one about a character connected to Reen, to avoid spoilers, being my two favorites. Lastly, in regards to the hub area, I love how it's a place for multiple different character interactions. One thing that I think Trails excels at is using its vast cast to bounce off of each other in interesting ways. I love when characters interact that you wouldn't expect to really interact with each other much. Some good examples being Tio and Lara's shared Mishi obsession, and Reen and Risha talking about the CS2 divertisement. I think these are fun ways for characters to connect and give insight to themselves in ways that you don't usually see. Lastly, on the gameplay, I would like to mention that many consider Reverie to be the height of the AT system combat. However, I do still prefer Cold Steel 4 slightly over Reverie in this regard. Sure, Reverie has more tools to play around with, but I feel like progression is not paced as well due to the gacha mechanics with the ceiling stones that allow you to get quartz. Because your ability to get good quartz is more down to luck, I feel like the game doesn't pace out its rewards as well as in Cold Steel 4, which leads to some balancing issues. Enough about the gameplay, let's talk about the story. I didn't know what to expect with this game's story due to it being an epilogue game. I just expected it to tie up loose ends from Crossbell and Erebonia, which it did, but it also provided so much more. The story told here is amazing. It continues to play on the political situation set up in Crossbell and Erebonia, and allows for some incredibly satisfying payoff. I also love the Trails to Walk system that allows for multiple routes to be played simultaneously. However, I did find myself just playing a route until I was blocked off and didn't make full use of the switching. All three routes are really good, but I did find Reen's and C's to be a bit better than Lloyd's. I also think that the pacing of this game is a bit too fast for my liking. It feels fine on a first playthrough because of the moments where you're forced into the True Reverie Corridor, but on New Game Plus, with your True Reverie Corridor progress saved, the shortness of the acts becomes much more noticeable. I also think the game lacking side quests is a bit of a bummer because I really like Trails side quests, but it's not game-breaking by any means. In terms of character writing, Reverie is all hits all around the board. We got some amazing moments with both the returning characters and new ones. Reen and C were the highlights of this game for me on that front. Getting a nice bow on Reen's character was something that I didn't know I needed until I saw it. C's whole spoiler-filled deal made me do a complete 180 on his character. He's amazing. The Crossbow characters also got a bit of love in this game that I feel like addressed some issues I had with them in Azure, which is really cool. That's also not to mention the amazing character moments and interactions. There are so many great moments in this game, but two speeches that stand out to me are Lapis's being human speech to C, and the obligation to be happy speech given by a certain character who I shall refrain from naming to avoid spoilers. They are some of the best in the series, and they really got me emotionally. I also really like the main antagonist of this game, who I will also not name because this section is filled with spoilers. I'll just say that while I do love their character, I also love how Falcom continues to use the medium of video games to tell parts of a story that only a video game can tell. So yeah, all in all, I love Reverie. It's a special game, and it really made me reflect on the series as a whole. It's a love letter in the best way possible and easily earns its spot in the top 5. Next up, we have my personal first Trails game. I didn't know it was part of a series back then. Relax. And this one holds a special place in my heart. I know I said that for a lot of the games on this list, but this one is in like a special place. Cold Steel 1 is a comfort game for me, up there with the likes of Kingdom Hearts 2, Ocarina of Time, and Skyrim. There's something about it that just gives me this warm feeling that I can't properly describe. Enough vagueness though, let's talk about specifics. Starting with the gameplay, Cold Steel 1 marked a little bit of a shake-up for the series' combat. The first thing it added were links, which allowed a partnered character to perform a follow-up attack when an enemy was unbalanced by a physical attack. Beyond the standard follow-up attack, you could also expend BP or Brave points to perform a rush or burst as well. The link system also bled outside of combat with the bonding system. Now, I know that a lot of people don't like the bonding system in the Cold Steel games, but I quite like it. They give extra insight into the characters while also allowing them to shine in the main story as well for the most part. I think it's a pretty significant step up from the bonding stuff in Zero and Azure as well. I do find the inability to see all of the bonding events in a first playthrough to be a bit annoying, but it's not game breaking by any means. Beyond the links, the combat itself was also pretty much in line with what came before, just iterated on a bit and in 3D. I also really love the 3D style of Cold Steel 1 and 2. Sure, Cold Steel 3 and Reverie and also Daybreak look way better, but something about the older models from the Cold Steel 1 and 2 art style just really hits for me. On the customization side, Cold Steel replaced the elemental value system from the previous games with the game just giving you the arts with the quartz. I know this change is pretty controversial, but I honestly really like it, and I think I prefer it over the older style. Don't get me wrong, I love the elemental value system and how it made you think about which quartz to use, but I think Cold Steel and Reverie allows for much greater build variety, while also still having a similar focus on careful decision making for builds, as most of the really good quartz with either insane stat boosts or some cool effect like domination don't give you any arts at all. This makes it so that you will still have to make some sacrifices based on whether or not you want art variety or a cracked as hell build with only 1 or 2 arts. It's not perfect, especially in this game, but I think the build variety more than makes up for it. The Master Quartz were also adjusted in this game, and it makes them feel more like a job system, almost in a roundabout way, as it allows for characters to fit certain roles. I love this change especially. The biggest downside are the gutted variety of arts from the Crossbelt games. Magic in general honestly gets a backseat in the Cold Steel games, especially in 1 and 2, with physical builds being much more broken. Not to say that they aren't viable, because you can make some absolutely cracked magic builds in CS2 and onwards, but physical always feels a bit more broken in these games in my opinion. I also love how these build varieties, due to the updated orbment system, leads to some wildly different outcomes from player to player. I've heard people talk about their own busted builds, and they're so different, which is really cool to me. You have crit magic builds, the arc/delay build with Reen, various busted Machias builds, and the evasion tank Fee build. My personal go-to is to beef the heck out of Lara, Reen, and Gaius, and just have them finish pretty much any boss in the game in a few S-crafts. This system is just so much fun to me. In terms of the story, I really love Cold Steel 1's. It's honestly my favorite arc starter, as is obvious from its placement on the list, and I know this is a hot take, but I think this is one of the better paced games in the series. Every chapter has at least something that moves the plot forward, while also giving multiple great character moments. Even the times where you're just walking around Thor's and Trista at the beginning of a chapter has some interesting story stuff, whether it's world building or conflicts between the members of Class 7. I also love how the game doesn't feel like it overuses the Imperial Liberation Front as antagonists. Sure, they appear in almost every chapter, but stuff like Chapter 2 and the Legram section of Chapter 5 manage to use different antagonistic forces to set up conflict in a way that also leads into the story of the arc. I know a lot of people will disagree with me on this whole section, but man, I love the story of Cold Steel 1. From its subtle world building and setup to its more in-your-face moments. And don't even get me started on how good that final stretch of the game is. I just love this game, man, and I find something else to love with each subsequent playthrough. In terms of characters, Cold Steel 1 introduces my favorite main cast in the entire series. I love the original Class 7. I know a lot of people have problems with some of the members, but I honestly love them all. They each feel pretty fleshed out to me, especially in context with the other games in the arc and the bonding events. Hell, I even think this game did a lot of heavy lifting to give each member at least some form of focus, with some obvious save it for the sequel characters like Emma and Milliam, but even then I still think the game did a lot to grab my interest in them. I also love their dynamic as a group, which I think is bolstered by the different conflicts that crop up between the members. When those conflicts are overcome, the class's bonds as a whole strengthen. Man, I just love Class 7. Call me biased, but I would die for any one of those lovable goofballs. I also really love Reen as a protagonist, even in this game. I do feel like he grows a lot more in the later games, but this is a really strong introduction for me. In terms of antagonists, barring one exception, I don't think the characters are individually super interesting. However, their philosophy as a group is what makes them shine, and it allows them to act as a perfect lens for Class 7 to see into the darker side of the Empire, especially in regards to the rampant imperialism and militarism. The individual members also do get more interesting in Cold Steel 2 for me, but it would be disingenuous of me to mark that up as a point for Cold Steel 1. I also really love the other students and faculty members of Thor's. While I think the branch campus students from Cold Steel 3 are more interesting in general, I think Cold Steel 1 does a much better job of getting you emotionally connected to Thor's and Trista. I was really feeling that Thor's pride by the end of the game. That's also not to say that the students in CS1 and 2 aren't interesting, because they are, and I love how each person is so distinct to the point that I could probably name who they are and what they do from memory. Again, it all works to build that sense of community and pride in the school. All in all, I love Cold Steel 1. It's a game that I just find to be really damn good and a bit underrated in all honesty. I like it more and more with each playthrough. It's also the game that got me into the series, so I'll always give it props for that. Despite my love for it, however, I will have to place it in the 4th slot, as I like the other 3 games above it just a bit more. If Trails of Cold Steel is the game that got me into the series, Trails in the Sky's second chapter was the game that made me a Trails fan. To give a little bit of background, like I said in the previous entry, Cold Steel 1 was my first Trails game, back before I knew it was a part of this connected series. I knew about the other games, but I thought it was more like Final Fantasy, with the games being standalone for the most part. After learning that they were connected, however, I went back and played the Sky games. I then went in a weird play order. I started with Cold Steel 1, went back and played Sky FC, then played Cold Steel 2 when it released in English, then went back and played Sky SC. Sacrilegious, I know. I then was caught up and pretty much just followed the English releases. So Sky the Third, then Cold Steel 3, then Cold Steel 4, then Zero, then Azure, then Reverie, then Nayuta, then finally Daybreak. After playing Cold Steel 2, I was firmly a fan of the Cold Steel games, but it wasn't until I played Sky SC that I became a fan of the entire series. Don't get me wrong, I loved Sky FC, but it wasn't until Sky SC that I realized that this series just had it, you know? Let's get into the weeds a bit. In terms of gameplay and customization, Sky SC is pretty much the same as Sky FC with a few adjustments. More quartz and arts were added in addition to abilities like chain crafts. Physical builds also got a bit of an overhaul, so they were more viable than they were in Sky FC. So not really much to talk about here. It's just Sky FC with a few more bells and whistles. So really good, but not as good as the later games in my opinion. I also think that, like Azure, this game just had some unfun boss design. It has been a while since I last played Sky SC, but I distinctly remember a lot of bosses kicking my ass even on normal mode. I especially remember one specific character starting a fight with their S-Craft, which is just downright unfair. Still has some amazing fights though, don't get me wrong. Where Sky SC truly shines, however, is in its story and characters. Starting with the story, I really love what is presented here with the conflict against Ouroboros. It makes for the most classic JRPG feeling game in the series, in my opinion, especially in the latter half of the game. With that said, I do feel like the early game drags a little bit in comparison to the later portions of the game. It took me a bit to get invested when I first played, but when the story gets going, it does not stop. The twists and turns are just expertly done and have me on the edge of my seat. In terms of characters, this game has too many amazing moments to count. The culmination of so many character arcs happen here, and I honestly think Sky SC is the main reason why the Sky cast is so loved by the fanbase. Almost every main cast member gets a moment to shine, and I think that is in part due to how the members of Ouroboros act as foils for the members of the main cast. It allows for the characters to grow in the face of conflict. Estelle is the highlight of the game for me, however. Her growth from Sky FC, and even throughout this game, is one of my favorite things in the entire series. I mentioned it in Sky FC, but I was not super into Estelle as a protagonist on my first playthrough of that game. Crazy, I know. But this game immediately put me on the Estelle train. She instantly shot up to being one of my favorite protagonists in anything ever. The antagonists are also really good too. I do think some Ouroboros members like Walter and Luciola aren't as interesting, but they are entertaining and have a certain charisma that just commands your attention. Louvet and Weissman are the standouts for me though, with Louvet being the better character in my opinion, but Weissman nails that pure evil type of antagonist in a way that Trails has yet to match again. While I personally prefer the more nuanced antagonists in the series in particular, I love a good hateable villain who's just an unabashed piece of shit. Wrapping up here, Sky SC is a special game. It's one that I will always remember fondly, and honestly one that I would consider to be at the height of the genre. It's a near perfect follow-up to a near perfect start. While Sky SC was the game that made me realize that I was a fan of the entire series, Cold Steel 2 was the one that made me realize just how amazing these games were. Sky SC just showed me that it was a series-wide thing rather than just a Cold Steel thing. Again, I only played 3 games before it. For the longest time, I would have considered this game and Cold Steel 1 to be neck and neck, but after a few replays, I just find Cold Steel 2 to keep widening the gap bit by bit. Just, man, do I love this game. We'll start again with the gameplay. Cold Steel 2 isn't that much different from Cold Steel 1, things were just balanced a bit more. The quartz variety was expanded, and we got things like Hades and the Lost Arts to make magic builds much more viable. A few new master quartz were also added, and some things were slightly adjusted, like how long the buffs from Marines motivate last and how certain crafts work in general. Nothing is too different in the long run. Following series tradition, orbit slots in the second game are upgradable rather than just the standard open-closed from their direct predecessors. However, I would like to mention that, and this is a minor thing mind you, that I feel like the slot upgrades here make a bit more sense to me due to Cold Steel having the whole quartz rarity thing. It just fits better in my brain, even if it's pretty much the exact same thing as Sky SC and Azure in practice. In terms of combat itself, the only other major change to the standard system is the addition of Overdrive, which works similarly to Burst from Azure. I think it's a cool mechanic, but one that is definitely a bit overpowered, so I can see why it wasn't kept around after this game. Also, while magic builds are now more viable in this outing, strength builds still outpace them in my opinion. The biggest change, however, were the Divine Knight battles. These existed in Cold Steel 1 as well, but only for the last 2 fights at the very end of the game, and not with the same mechanical depth. I honestly really love the Divine Knight battles. They're a lot of fun, and I slightly prefer them over the Grendel fights from Daybreak, but both are still really cool. In terms of story, I love Cold Steel 2's. I sometimes hear it referred to as a filler game with not much happening to advance the plot of the Erebonia arc or the series as a whole, but I very much disagree with that sentiment. Cold Steel 2 does a lot to move the story forward, especially with how it connects to Osborne and Ouroboros. Sure, a lot of those aspects might not be as prominent until later games, but the amount of setup done here is incredible in hindsight. However, it's not just the setup for the later games that makes the story good. The payoff here from the stuff set up in Cold Steel 1 is also really well done. I also love how it shows another side of things that happened in Azure, as this game takes place during the fragments and finale of that game. I even find Act 2 to be pretty good, which is a part of the game that I know a lot of people do not like. I love how it builds up to what happens in the finale, as well as all of the free roam stuff and uniting all of the Thor students together as you travel. I can't really talk more on this point as I would get dangerously close to spoiler territory. However, I will mention that everything from the finale to the epilogue is one of the strongest runs in the series in my opinion. The divertissement and the epilogue also give us a proper falling action, which is rare in video games. And even this series, which is one that does not shy away from giving the player moments to breathe. However, it is that ending itself that has stuck with me the most. It is one of my favorite endings in anything ever, and is only beat by one other ending in the series for me. And even then, not by much. It might be because I beat this game near the time when I had just started college after graduating from high school, so the ending resonated with me in a personal way, much more so than any other game in the series. But even then, I just think the ending is beautiful. It's a masterclass in how to do a bittersweet ending. There's a reason why I used To a Glimmering Tomorrow, which is the final boss theme in the epilogue, for my outro. It's damn near perfect. The characters are also amazing in this game. Class 7 continues to shine with every member getting at least something, even if Elliot's biggest thing was in a side quest. There's also a lot of great continuation for characters, especially Emma, Elisa, Millium, Crow, and Rean. Speaking of Rean, I mentioned in the CS1 entry that I wasn't as big on Rean after CS1 the first time I played it, but CS2 is what drove him from the I love him category to the he's one of my favorite characters / protagonists of all time category pretty quickly. He has so many great moments in this game. One standout is his conversation with Elise in the prologue. I love how it shows his character in a completely different light, and how she points out that a specific trait of his, one that is also present in Estelle and Lloyd and is seen as a strength for them, is almost twisted and self-destructive for him because of the way he views himself. Side note, something that I love about Trails is how each of the major arc protagonists seem like a natural follow-up to the previous one, but with a different spin on things. They all still have that similar traits that I think match what I think the thesis of the series is at this point, that being the whole no man is an island thing. But they put a slight spin on things in a way that feels so natural. I just love it a lot. Regardless, I love Rean in this game, and this is probably where he became my favorite protagonist in the series. In terms of antagonists, however, I would say they are pretty well done. Most of the major players are either really compelling or just entertaining as hell, like McBurn and Duvalie. I know a lot of people have issues with a specific antagonist, but I think they were meant to be not great intentionally. The game makes it pretty clear that they do not run the show by any means despite what they believe. It's that personality trait that makes a certain reveal in the finale work way better in terms of the in-universe politics, in my opinion. Hope I was vague here. While the main cast of villains isn't my favorite in the series, I still think they're really solid, even if I find many of the characters to be more compelling in later games. So yeah, I love Cold Steel 2. I know it's a fairly divisive entry, but it's a game that holds a special place in my heart. Everything from the story to the characters to the gameplay to the music to the late autumn, early winter vibes just really resonate with me. I will, however, not defend how bullshit that one scene being locked behind New Game Plus is. That shit's whack. In conclusion, Cold Steel 2 is peak among peak, but it's still beat out by one other game for me. That's right, my favorite Trails game is Trails of Cold Steel 4. Now this game is very divisive, probably the most divisive game in the series. You typically either see people rank it as their favorite or their least favorite. I am obviously among the former group. I love this game. When you hear people talk about Cold Steel 4, even in a positive light, you hear them say something along the lines of, it has high highs but really low lows, and I honestly don't agree with this sentiment. This game for sure has really high highs, but I don't think it has any real lows at all in my opinion. But let's talk about specifics, starting with gameplay for one final time. The gameplay in Cold Steel 4 follows the same style as Cold Steel 3, except that things are a lot more balanced in this outing. Orders were reworked to be less broken and everything feels a bit smoother. It is for that reason that it's my favorite turn-based battle system in any game. I even like it a bit more than Reverie, which is really similar, just with a bit more stuff, but I feel like Cold Steel 4 paces itself a bit better in terms of giving the player access to powerful cores. In terms of customization, it's pretty much the same as Cold Steel 3, with a few more added quartz and master quartz. Lost Arts also make a return here and are much more powerful as they offer insane stat bonuses in addition to the powerful arts. It makes them feel more powerful and valuable in that sense. The biggest change to the customization, besides the switch over to the slot levels again, is the ability to have the same master quartz equipped as the sub-master quartz for multiple characters, which is a very welcome change as it expands the build variety tremendously. That, coupled with the insane amount of party members to work with, makes for an incredibly fun system. Now let's talk about the story. In my opinion, Trails of Cold Steel 4's story is amazing. One of my favorites in any video game. I know a lot of people have certain issues with it, especially in regards to the curse, but I really love it. Speaking of the curse, I also like it as a plot device. I wasn't sure how to feel about it when it was first presented in Cold Steel 3, but when I learned more about it in this game, I really began to like it. Sure, it does feel overused in some sections, mainly the side quests, but for the most part, it's an interesting way to tie in the supernatural aspect of Trails with the idea of rampant nationalism, imperialism, and militarism, which I think fits in with another major theme of the series, that being the strengths and weaknesses of humanity. It's also similar to a lot of other things in previous games, especially something from Sky, so it never felt out of place to me. Regardless, I also think the story is just really well told, with hype moments paced wonderfully with slower ones. I also think the pacing in general is really good. I know a lot of people don't like Act 2 and treat it like it's horrible, but I honestly love it. The beginning and the end have some of the best moments in the series, and even the middle section, which I don't think is as good as the rest of the game, is still fine to me, and has a lot of good moments. The game also has my favorite ending in not just the series, but in all of fiction. It is so beautifully done. I have this huge smile on my face as I try to hold back tears whenever I see it. It is a perfect end, not just to the Erebonia arc, but to what is essentially the climax of the first half of the series. It's peak. Also, props to the beginning and the end of the ending song for having the melody from To a Glimmering Tomorrow. I wish I could talk in more specifics, but this video is already way too long, and I would tread dangerously close to spoilers if I kept going. Just know that I love this game's story. As for the characters, I think they are really good in this game, especially Reen, Claire, Rufus, Osborne, and Altina. Honestly, the entire main cast is amazing. Sure, much of the members of Old Class 7 don't get too much in the main story, as many of their arcs finished in Cold Steel 2, but they're still great. New Class 7 also gets a lot of great moments throughout the game, but especially in Act 1. The antagonists are also really good, with Osborne stealing the show. I was not disappointed by him after all of that build-up. One of the best antagonists of all time. I honestly think this game has the strongest cast of antagonists in the series for me. Even 3 characters who are a bit controversial, I loved 2 of them with their arcs feeling very Shakespearean. The third I found to be not bad. Not great as an antagonist, but I don't have near the amount of vitriol for them that others do. They were fine, and I enjoyed their arc overall. Wrapping up here, I understand that a lot of people do not like this game, which I think is fine, opinions and all that. However, I personally love this game. To me, it is almost as perfect a Trails game can get. And I think it's going to be hard for a future game to top it for me, based on majorly on the amount of emotional attachment I have towards it. Trails of Cold Steel 4 is just that good in my opinion. So there you have it. This is my personal ranking for the Trails series games that I have played. I know I get a lot of disagreement in the comments, just knowing the series and its fan base for as long as I have. Please just remember that this is my opinion, and honestly, the gap between Sky the Third and Cold Steel 4 for me is pretty small, despite how much time I spent yapping to you about this. They are all, barring Nayuta, still some of my favorite games of all time, probably all cracking the top 50 for me. With that said, please feel free to leave your own rankings in the comments down below. I only ask that you be respectful to the others commenting. I want to keep things chill and not promote an aggressive environment. We're talking about games that we love here. I would also ask that you not spoil anyone either. I will remove your comment if I see something too spoilery. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and that you can see just how much I love this series. If you liked the video, please think about liking and subscribing. Maybe check out some of my other videos first to see if you like what you see here. Also subscribe to the Deserted Gamer podcast, which is the podcast I do with a friend of mine from college. We talk about video games on there. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week.